This is the Made for Living Well podcast, hosted by Alexa Sherm, the place to create a life well lived.
Welcome back to the podcast. As always, my name's Alexa, and I'm so glad you're here. We are in the middle of a very long series called Health School, where I teach you what it means to live healthy. Now, I always say it, but I feel the need to say it again. You were made for health, which means it's available for all of us. It might look differently, it might feel differently, it might appear different, but we all have the ability to live a healthy life if we just learn how to create it. And today in the podcast, we're going to talk all about that by defining the difference between real rest and artificial rest, and even going as far to say, what does God say about rest? Because I think we have a lot of ideas, but we're falling just slightly short or twisting it just enough that we can't see the results that we want to see, simply because our ideas may not be accurate. So today we're going to talk all about rest. Now we're going to get more in depth into what God says about rest in the blog post, which can be found at thelivingwell.com/334. Again, that blog post is going to talk specifically about what God said about rest, which I think is really important in understanding, because while we might be in our rest era, we are also living in one of the most restless generations in history. And so we can't just articulate that rest is actually nourishing us, at least not in the way that we're going about it. So we're going to learn more about that in this podcast. But first, I want to remind you, we are just starting the Nourish 30 Challenge. If you have no idea what that is, head to thelivingwell.com, check it out. It's basically a free challenge that encourages you to add health to your life. It's not a subtraction, but an addition in the expansive form of health that helps to expand your life. And this podcast goes along with that challenge as we talk about what it means to Sabbath weekly. Again, you can learn more about that at thelivingwell.com. But for now, let's start talking about rest. Because as I mentioned, we are living in our rest era. Like always, we tend to flip from one extreme to the other extreme, and we just came off of what was called hustle culture, where people were working extended hours, long work weeks, no separation between work and home life. It really just felt like work all the time. What we found through that generation of hustle culture is that it was not healthy for our bodies, right? Like we were stressed, there was the rise of adrenal fatigue, and all of these conversations that our bodies were just overwhelmed. So naturally, we signified that work or excess work was the problem. In some cases, just work in general was the problem. And thus, like all things, we flipped to the opposite extreme. And now, we're comfortably nestled into our rest era. And there's nothing wrong with rest, just like there's nothing wrong with work. Both are absolutely needed in the health of our whole and really just the health of our life. We were made to work. Like God created us to work even long before the fall. The garden was created that we would tend to it and work in it. Work isn't a product of our sin or our fallen world. It is a part of our human nature. It's part of our design. Like we are made to do, to go, to move, to work, to do hard things. Like we are capable of that. And I think in our rest era, we've neglected to understand how important it actually is to do work. Like we need to do work. And I'm going to stress that all throughout the podcast. But on the flip side, we also need to rest. Rest is very nourishing. It's very supporting of our body. We need both. And that's really the scope of life. It's always about a balance, not one extreme or the other. It's about both. And that doesn't always mean 50-50, but it definitely means within a 24-hour day, you have both, or within every 7 days, you have both. Like we need to create a balance. And that means we also need to understand that just like extra work or excess work and pushing your body too hard was a detriment to your health, so is resting too much. And I would argue that there's a lot of people who are sitting in rest, maybe because your body just naturally fell to the other extreme. That's the law of physics. It's not necessarily something you can fight. But what I am trying to tell you is maybe it's time to rebalance your life, to recognize that one or the other is not best, but we need both. Now, of course, that comes back to defining what work and rest is. And again, that lays the foundation to say hey, work is also really needed in our life. Now, when we talk about this biologically, I think it's really interesting to come at a different perspective, to recognize this on an energetic level. So I'm going to do my best to explain this because I think it shows the importance of what real rest is versus artificial rest, and also why work is still important. Now, when we look at our body, as we've talked about all throughout health school, we understand that energy is the most important component of a living body. Your body, first and foremost, is always working to manage and conserve energy because energy is your number one form of survival. So without enough energy, your body shifts every single function to store, hoard, and conserve energy. But in a thriving life, we're really expanding that energy to use it, to live life. We don't need to hoard it. We're just flowing through us. But the thing about this is that expanded energy or thriving energy is a movement. It's always in motion. Surviving energy is stored, it's hoarded, it's stuck, it's conserved. It's packaged up, right? Where you can't necessarily get to it easily, but it's also not moving very readily. And this is a really good indication of why we need to work, because work helps our body to move energy. It helps our body to move really every physical process that's happening inside of our body. Everything is always in motion. Our bodies, all of life really is in motion. And I think if you take a moment to just look at nature, or to look at yourself, or to even think and just close your eyes and slow down enough to even feel the movement within your body. You can physically sometimes feel the lymphatic movement or your muscle movements or your nervous system movements. You can feel emotions moving throughout your body. When you get sad, you can feel that. If you get nervous, you can feel that in your stomach. We can feel the movement of our biology. And truly, in a thriving state, it would always be in motion. But in order for our body to be in motion, it needs to work, and you have to help it work. Energy is created as a byproduct of work. And the way to expand that energy is to continuously move that energy, which means movement is critical. And so I want to express first and foremost that we should be moving our bodies. We should be doing work. Now, the problem in today's age is not that we're not doing work, it's that we're physically exhausting or working different parts of our biology without actually working the whole or finding balance within all of it. What I'm trying to say is if we separate our mind, body, and soul for a minute, even though they're highly connected, they are separate in a lot of ways. And what we're finding right now is that we're working in a way that is exhausting us mentally, in our mind, sometimes even in our soul. But physically speaking, we're just sitting. We are a generation that sits more than any other generation. We feel tired, we feel exhausted because we are mentally draining our energy, but our physical energy is still high, which creates this mass imbalance in your mind and body. And that imbalance leads to a lot of turmoil inside your biology. Because again, they may be separate, but they're all connected. And if there's an imbalance anywhere inside your biology, it will respond accordingly. It will work to try to achieve balance. In some of the ways your body does this, if you're mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted, generally you also think you're physically exhausted. But what I'm trying to say, that's not always the case. A lot of times you have high physical energy. And when you expand that gap between low mental energy and high physical energy, you open the door to things like anxiety, weight gain, cravings, overwhelm, burnout, and really restlessness. You become really restless because you actually have energy to burn. And so when we talk about rest and work, we have to start to identify, where am I actually exhausted? What piece of my life am I feeling overwhelmed in? If it's not in a physical realm, right? Like I am just overexerting my body, then we can probably start to recognize that it's probably a lot of mental and physical exhaustion. And while that's good, like you can push your body and mind and soul in those ways, and that's not wrong. It's how do we balance all of that energy into one category? And that's where we have to start talking about rest, because we can't just say that rest is sitting. And I think that's what a lot of people identify rest with is I'm just going to sit, or I'm going to lay down, or I need to take a nap, or I need to sleep. And while there might be some cases where, yes, we do need to sit down, where, yes, we do need to rest our bodies, and yes, all of us need to sleep well. The problem is if we're mentally exhausted but not physically exhausted, the longer we sit, the more restless we become because we're not actually resting. We're becoming restless. We're not creating the balance the body is looking for. And what I'm trying to tell you is it's always about balance. So sometimes rest might be sitting, but there's other times where rest might actually be moving. And this is where we have to start to reclassify rest not as just a sitting or a laying or a sleeping. It may be those things, but it also might be a long walk with your best friend. It might be gardening. It might be playing a recreational sport. In a lot of ways, rest is about moving. It's about mobilizing energy, trying to rebalance yourself. And so I want to expand that definition of rest because I think a lot of times, especially in our rest era, we are sitting far too long. And we're engaging in these practices of rest that aren't actually restful. They're actually doing more harm than good, especially if it's causing that sense of restlessness in you. And these are what I classify as like the artificial forms of rest. Things that we think are helping us rest, but actually things that might be stressing our body more. And generally speaking, those activities of rest are going to look different based on what you need, but it might be binging Netflix, scrolling social media, sitting for prolonged periods of time, living in isolation, like becoming like a little hermit, an introvert. And I'm not saying that introverts are wrong, but I'm saying when we become overly introverted and overly isolated, this is generally a sign that we're not actually generating flow and creating rest. Because rest is about a rebalancing. It should actually fill you with energy, not drain you of energy, which is the best way to clarify and determine whether you're living in artificial rest or true rest. Again, true rest will always fill you. And that might be like, yes, sleeping well. It might be also sitting down for a brief moment and reading a book or taking a hot bath. But like I mentioned, it might be actually expending some energy, trying to rebalance your mind and body into an even flow. So sometimes that might mean you got to go burn some energy off. Even though you feel mentally exhausted, does not mean you're physically exhausted. And the more you do this and regain balance in your mind, body, and soul, the more harmonized your entire physiology will be, and you'll feel more energized and thriving overall. Now, I think sleep is one really good indicator to determine whether you're resting too much or not enough, or whether you're engaging in real rest or artificial rest. And I bring this up because we recognize sleep as one of our best forms of rest, which, yes, it is. We must sleep. Sleep is a good reset or a good rebalancer, a regulator of our body. But sleep or insomnia or sleep problems is the number one recurring medical condition today. Why are we not sleeping? I mean, of course, there's a host of other factors, but we have to look at the number one factor being an imbalance in mental and physical energy. Feeling mentally exhausted, perceiving that as exhaustion across the board, when really you have high physical energy. And as long as you have high physical energy, it will be really, really difficult to sleep. Sleep comes from a level of physical exhaustion or a lack of physical energy. We use that to regain our energy. And thus, we sleep well when we have low physical energy. It's a rebalancing. Now, I like to look at kids as great examples for a lot of things. And we can recognize that kids are pretty active. And the more active they are, the more they get outside, and we always say like burn off their energy, the better they will sleep. But if you've ever had a kid on a rainy day or a snow day and you're like, they just camped out in front of electronics, that might mentally exhaust them. And they might actually seem tired, but they probably will struggle to fall asleep and even stay asleep and sleep well. And you can almost see that imbalance happening inside of them. You might not have associated it until this moment, but that imbalance is likewise preventing them from sleeping well. So again, the goal of rest has to be a filling. Like all things, it needs to be an expansion of energy. It's helping you to fill your life, to expand your life, not take away from it. And it certainly shouldn't be making you more exhausted in the process. So again, the difference between real rest and artificial rest is activities that actually fill you with energy can be considered rest-based activities. Rest is meant to fill you, where artificial rest seems to take away energy. It's the opposite approach. And again, this often leads to restlessness, anxiety, overwhelm, and really can set a pattern of just needing more and more and more rest. Like it's like the process of if you don't sleep well, then the next day you feel tired, and you might feel like you need a nap, and then you try to go to bed, but you took a nap, so then you're not sleeping well. And it's like this vicious cycle where you're always tired. One of the best medicines to help you sleep is to move your body more. So I need us to start looking at life in a different view. You are made to work. Our bodies are made to do hard things. And not all work and hard things have to be considered draining, but a lot of times they can also be considered rest. And specifically, when we look at things like stress and emotions, these things need to move through your body. Emotion is literally defined as energy in motion. If we are not moving our body, a lot of times these things become stuck inside of our bodies. And that is where problems are had. When energy gets stuck, when it becomes stagnant and stale, you start storing, hoarding, and conserving, and you open the door to a host of health problems. So yes, you need to rest. Rest is really important. But I also want us to define what does rest mean for you and being willing to understand what that looks like from a day-to-day basis. Because in one day, it might mean I just need to go to bed earlier. And another day, it might mean I need to get outside and go on a walk. We have to recognize it for ourselves. And honestly, when we approach this subject about what God says about rest, I also think that's a really personal thing. Like He created us to work, and He also created us to rest. And rest in His definition is, yes, the opposite of work in a lot of ways, but it's more of a wonder and awe, a living. It's really just recognizing all of the goodness of life and being able to live it out. To not be so focused on work that you can't live, but also not be so focused on rest that you can't live. And the intent of the Sabbath was really to be in awe of God's creation, to really live inside of it. And I also think in the process of this, and what you're going to learn over in the blog post, and what God says about rest, is that we're living in a time in life when the lines of our rhythms are really blurred. Like we're living in a rhythmless society. But humans, our biology, was designed based on rhythms. Everything inside of you is working based on a flow, a rhythm, a clock, like your circadian clock. That's all considered a rhythm of your biology. And that rhythm should follow the rhythms of your life. But the problem happens when we start to live in these rhythmless societies where there's no rhyme or reason, where we're living in these extreme-based lifestyles where we don't have the rhythm of both. But I think God in His goodness, when He created life, He set rhythms by setting the sun and the moon, by creating day and night, by creating the seasons of life and the days and the months. God set rhythms. He set our biology to work on rhythms. And thus, having the ability to understand the rhythm of work and rest is vital to the health of our whole. It's not one or the other. It's a balance of both. And what that looks like is going to be determined based on what you're going through and the season of life you're living in. It's not about perfection. There's not the legalistic side of things because Jesus died at the cross to take away the legalism of the Sabbath. But it's really about establishing the rhythm of working because we were called to work. We are created as makers of the world, but then also to rest and to live and to expand in the making that was created, to really worship God in his creation and to really live it out. Like God also wants us to live here on earth. And I think that's so beautiful about the rhythms of work and rest is that we're called to work, but there's blessing in rest because we get to live in the work that has been created. We need to reestablish the rhythms of work and rest in our life and not get so bogged down by what each means, but to really expand it for what we need it to be. So when it comes to like even a Sabbath, for some people in different seasons of life, a Sabbath might mean I need to lay on the couch and take a nap today. You might need to read a book and literally do nothing. And that's okay. But on the flip side, a Sabbath for you might be getting out and going on a bike ride or playing a recreational sport, playing some pickup games of pickleball, getting relational and doing something social. For you, it might mean more activity, but in a rest-based way, in a way that fills you with energy and also helps you to live more life. See, the human nature is always going to pull us to the extremes. It's what we do out of survival. The more unsafe you are, the more you've been through, and really the more imbalance in your energy, the stronger the pull to the extremes is going to be. That doesn't mean you have to fight it, but I think just being aware of the natural pull to the extremes helps you to remember it's not that one is right or wrong, but it's learning to revive the rhythms of life. We really need to get back into these rhythms and live with the self-awareness to recognize, but what is rest to me today? What do I need this week? And also recognizing that on some level, we all need to rest from the work, knowing that the rest is going to generate energy to help us to work, to expand that, to really embrace it and to live within it because both bring blessings to our life. Here's the thing. We were created for rhythms, and we need to revitalize those rhythms in our life to really live as our healthiest selves. Thriving comes from a movement, from energy flow, and that comes out of both work and rest. It's the balance of both, and it's a balance that's created throughout our mind, body, and soul. They're separate, but they definitely are connected. And it's that connection that really creates the outcomes of your biology. God created us as makers. We are created to work and to do. We should live that and find joy in that. But if you're feeling restless and you're feeling anxious and overwhelmed, take note that maybe it's because your rest-based activities are really not that restful. And yes, you equally need rest just like you need to work. And what that rest is going to be different depending on your season of life. It's paying attention and recognizing what do I need to do to fill myself with energy. Now, before we wrap up this podcast, I do want to say in my own life, one of the reasons why rest has been so difficult is because I constantly feel like I don't have time, right? Like there's so many things to do and there's not enough time to do it. Now, I know time is a popular excuse, but I've started to understand time in the same way of energy. While we might all have the same amount of time, just like we all tend to have the same amount of energy, it's relative based on how you live it, which means there are things that you can do to expand time, to essentially generate more time and energy, which comes from getting more done in less time. And there are things that tend to reduce time, right? Like that just take time and suck life out of your life. And it's just making you feel like you don't have time. What I'm trying to say is time is a terrible excuse. And I've had to learn this for myself. Because the truth is, if we don't take time to rest, we will be forced into rest. Like it will eventually take time. Instead, I've had to recognize that there's a lot of things in my life that help expand my life, which essentially means I don't have time not to rest. Like rest is what helps me go out and live. So if you're thinking like, yeah, this all sounds great, I can set all the right intentions, but at the end of the day, this is just impossible because I have too much to do. One, I totally get it. But this is a mindset shift. Like a lot of things in health, it's recognizing how these expand your life, how resting can actually expand and enhance your time. You don't have time not to rest, is what I'm trying to say. So don't let rest become an excuse. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the blog post. So make sure you head on over there at thelivingwell.com/334. And remember, this is a gift. It is for you to fully embrace life. And the whole point of health is not to live for health, but to use health to get out to live. I hope this encouraged you today. Don't forget to tune in to the next podcast where we're going to dive into a little bit more about the essence of health and the essence of living as we talk about feminine and masculine energy and really how to embody that energy to, again, expand time, to expand rest, to expand living. And then we're going to dive more into bioenergetic nutrition. So stay tuned because there's so many good podcasts coming your way.